Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but disrespect can curdle it in an instant. I spent years earning my wings in the deadliest skies on Earth, only to come home and be treated like a glorified secretary by my own cousin. Then, his Navy SEAL father stepped in. It had been exactly 72 hours since I last smelled burning aviation fuel, hot dust, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Now, sitting on the sprawling, multi-level mahogany deck of my uncle's lakeside estate in Michigan, the air was thick with a completely different kind of smoke: hickory wood, sizzling Wagyu burgers, and the suffocating perfume of my aunt's citronella candles. The 4th of July family barbecue was a sacred tradition in the Jenkins family. For the past 3 years, I had missed it. I had been a ghost, a name on a holiday card, a brief, static-filled voice on an encrypted satellite phone. My family knew I was a captain in the United States Army. They knew I flew helicopters. What they didn't know, what I was strictly forbidden from telling them, was that I had recently been selected for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Airborne, the Night Stalkers. My days of flying standard supply routes were long gone. For the last 18 months, I had been flying heavily modified MH-60M Black Hawks, entirely in the dark, inserting Tier 1 operators into the most hostile, unforgiving environments on the planet. To my family, I was just Elena, Tom's quiet daughter who joined the military to pay for college and somehow ended up sticking around to drive the buses in the sky. "Elena! Over here, kiddo!" I blinked against the glaring afternoon sun, pulling my polarized aviators down slightly to see my dad waving enthusiastically from the edge of the lawn. Dad was a sweet, mild-mannered accountant who treated my military service as if I were away at a particularly rigorous summer camp. Beside him stood Uncle Rick. If my dad was a golden retriever, his older brother Rick was a wolf who had long ago learned how to wear a collar. Richard Jenkins was a retired senior chief petty officer who had spent 25 years in Naval Special Warfare, SEAL Team 6. He was a man carved out of granite, with piercing, cold blue eyes and a demeanor so deeply disciplined, it bordered on terrifying. Even in a Hawaiian shirt and khaki shorts, flipping burgers with a pair of stainless steel tongs, he looked like he was assessing the perimeter for threats. He rarely spoke of his service, and I never asked. We shared a quiet, unspoken understanding, or so I thought. I respected the hell out of him. And then there was Tyler. Well, if it isn't Captain Elena. A loud, booming voice echoed from the sliding glass doors. Tyler, Uncle Rick's 28-year-old son, swaggered onto the deck holding a craft IPA. He was a year younger than me, a vice president at a logistics tech startup, and the living embodiment of unearned confidence. Tyler was a guy who woke up at 4:00 a.m. to do ice baths, listened to alpha male business podcasts at double speed, and wore heavy tactical plate carriers while running on his expensive treadmill in the suburbs. He had briefly considered ROTC in college before dropping out due to a nagging lacrosse injury. Ever since, he had compensated for his lack of military service by adopting an aggressive, pseudo-warrior persona, much to the silent exhaustion of everyone around him. Most of all, he worshipped his father's legacy, entirely missing the quiet humility that made Uncle Rick who he was. "Hey, Tyler," I said, forcing a polite smile as he approached. "Good to see you." "Look at you, still rocking the short hair, I see," Tyler chuckled, pulling me into a stiff, one-armed hug. "How was the deployment? Where'd they have you this time? Germany? South Korea? Hanging out in the officers' club?" "Middle East, mostly. A bit of Africa," I replied vaguely, reaching for a plastic cup of ice water. "Just doing my job." Right, the great logistics machine," Tyler said, taking a loud sip of his beer. He leaned against the railing, puffing his chest out. "Dad always says logistics win wars, but man, I couldn't do what you do. Just sitting in a cockpit all day, ferrying MREs and spare parts from one safe zone to another. I need action. I need to be in the mud, like Dad." I glanced over at Uncle Rick. He was focused on the grill, the smoke billowing around his broad shoulders. He didn't seem to hear his son. "It's a team effort," I said evenly. My mind briefly flashed to a night in Somalia 2 months ago, tracer fire lighting up the sky like deadly green fireflies, my co-pilot shouting out coordinates, while our aircraft took a half-dozen rounds to the fuselage as we held a hover over a hot extraction zone. I pushed the memory down. Lock it away. Compartmentalize. Sure, Tyler smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. Everyone gets a participation trophy nowadays, even the Air Force. Wait, Army, right? Whatever. Hey, did you see my post about the 7-5 hard challenge? I ran 15 miles with a 30-pound ruck last weekend, blistered my heels to hell, but you gotta embrace the suck. You guys ever do any rucking in the aviation branch? Or do they just give you guys a golf cart to get to the runway? We stay active, Ty, I said, my voice dangerously tight. I bet, Tyler laughed, turning to address a few other cousins who had gathered around with their plates. Elena here is the family's very own Uber driver. 5 stars, right? Just don't ask her to parallel park the chopper. A few of the younger cousins giggled. My dad, bless his heart, stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Now, Tyler, that's not fair. Elena works very hard. Being an officer is a lot of responsibility. I'm just messing around, Uncle Tom. Tyler threw his hands up in mock surrender. Just giving the captain a hard time. Gotta test that military bearing, right? Can't have our troops getting soft. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool water slide down my throat. I looked at Tyler, at his perfectly groomed hair, his unblemished skin, his expensive watch, and I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of isolation. I was home, surrounded by my blood relatives, yet I had never felt further away from them. I was standing in a sunny backyard in Michigan, but part of my soul was still thousands of miles away, wrapped in Kevlar, waiting for the green light to drop into the dark. As the afternoon dragged into the early evening, the July heat finally began to break, giving way to a cool breeze off the lake. The family had moved from the deck down to the expansive patio by the water. String lights flickered to life overhead, casting a warm, golden glow over the half-empty plates of potato salad and ribs. I had spent the last 2 hours actively avoiding Tyler, burying myself in conversation with my Aunt Susan about her garden and listening to my dad talk about his recent golf trip. It was a fragile, pleasant bubble of normalcy. But peace, much like a secure perimeter in a combat zone, is usually an illusion. Tyler had spent the afternoon drinking steadily. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, his voice had grown louder, his gestures more animated. He was holding court by the fire pit, a captive audience of uncles and younger cousins surrounding him as he spun a tale about a recent corporate retreat. So there we are, out in the woods in Idaho, right? Tyler boasted, gesturing with a half-eaten hot dog. Our CEO hired these ex-Rangers to run us through a leadership crucible. We're talking sleep deprivation, carrying logs, navigating by the stars, real Spartan stuff. 3 of the guys in marketing literally cried and quit by day 2. But you know me. I just dug deep. It's all about mindset. Dad taught me that. It's the warrior mentality. Uncle Rick was sitting quietly on a cedar bench a few feet away, nursing a glass of bourbon. He wasn't looking at Tyler. He was staring out at the dark water of the lake, his expression completely unreadable. Honestly, Tyler continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto me. I think that corporate crucible was tougher than basic training nowadays. No offense, Elena, but I read an article the other day about how they're lowering the physical standards across the board, especially for female pilots. They're basically just giving away wings to hit diversity quotas. The patio went dead silent. The crickets in the grass suddenly seemed incredibly loud. Aunt Susan stopped mid-sentence, her hand freezing over a bowl of coleslaw. My dad's face flushed red. Tyler, my dad warned softly. That's enough. What? I'm just stating facts, Tyler said, leaning forward, emboldened by the alcohol and the silence of the crowd. He looked directly at me, a mocking smirk playing on his lips. I mean, look at Elena. No offense, 'cause you're great, but you weigh what, 130 pounds soaking wet? If a bird goes down, what are you gonna do? You can't drag a full-grown man out of a burning wreck. That's why they keep you girls in the rear with the gear, flying the safe routes. My hands were resting on my knees. I stared at my fingernails, noticing a faint crescent of dried grease under my thumbnail that I had missed during my shower. My heart rate was steady, 60 beats per minute. The same heart rate I had when the warning alarms blared in my cockpit. "You don't know what my routes are, Tyler," I said softly. My voice wasn't angry. It was devoid of all emotion. A flatline. "Oh, come on. It's not a secret," Tyler scoffed, taking a step toward me. He was relishing the spotlight, desperate to establish his dominance. "You're Army Aviation. You fly the big cargo birds, right? Chinooks or whatever? Taking boxes from point A to point B. Dad was a Tier 1 operator. He was the tip of the spear. You're the, what? The Amazon Prime delivery driver of the military?" He laughed at his own joke. No one else did. "I fly Blackhawks," I corrected him quietly. "Same difference." Tyler waved his hand dismissively. "It's a flying bus." Honestly, it bothers me when people act like everyone in a uniform is some kind of hero. Stolen valor is a real thing, you know? Letting people think you're in the shit when you're just punching a clock in the sky? "Tyler, stop it right now!" Aunt Susan hissed, looking nervously at her husband. But Uncle Rick didn't move. He simply took a slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes still fixed on the lake. "I'm just asking a question," Tyler defended himself, throwing his arms wide. He turned back to me, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Tell me this, Captain. In the movies, all the badass fighter pilots and operators have these cool call signs. Maverick, Iceman, Viper. Do they even give you guys call signs in the logistics squad? Or is your call sign just, like, Princess, Tinkerbell?" "Tyler!" My dad snapped, finally finding his voice, standing up from his lawn chair. "I will not let you speak to my daughter this way." "It's fine, Dad," I said, putting a hand up. I didn't break eye contact with my cousin. I was tired. I was bone-weary. For 18 months, I had bitten my tongue, hidden my patches, and lied to my family to protect my unit's operational security. But the utter disrespect, the arrogant assumption of my weakness, finally cracked the dam. I didn't have to tell him where I had been, but I could answer his question. I stood up slowly. Despite being nearly a foot shorter than him, I squared my shoulders, letting the posture of a night stalker command the space. "You want to know my call sign, Tyler?" I asked, my voice cutting through the humid night air like a rotor blade. "Yeah," Tyler sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Enlighten us, Captain. What do they call the girl who delivers the mail?" I held his gaze, my face a mask of absolute stone. "Outlaw 6'4". The words hung in the air. For a second, nothing happened. Tyler just blinked, his smirk faltering slightly as he tried to process the name. "Outlaw 6'4"? What is that supposed to mean? "Sounds like you pulled it out of a video game." Clatter. The sound of shattering glass violently interrupted him. Every head on the patio snapped toward the cedar bench. Uncle Rick was on his feet. The heavy crystal tumbler he had been holding was shattered on the stone pavers, the expensive bourbon pooling around his boots. He wasn't looking at the broken glass. He wasn't looking at Tyler. Uncle Rick was staring directly at me. The color had completely drained from his tanned, weathered face. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. The terrifyingly calm, stoic man I had known my entire life looked as if he had just seen a ghost walk out of the dark. "Dad?" Tyler asked, his bravado evaporating instantly at the sight of his father's expression. "Dad, you okay? You dropped your glass." Uncle Rick ignored his son entirely. He took one slow, deliberate step toward me, his boots crunching over the broken glass. The silence on the patio was now absolute, thick, and suffocating. "What did you say?" Uncle Rick asked. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It was the voice of a man who had seen hell, and who had suddenly realized I was standing right there in the flames with him. I stood my ground, my heart finally starting to pound against my ribs. "Outlaw 6'4", Senior Chief." Uncle Rick stopped. The air between us cracked with a sudden, devastating realization. He closed his eyes, taking a ragged, shuddering breath, and when he opened them again, they were entirely different. The quiet, distant uncle was gone. Standing in front of me was the Tier 1 operator, the man who had been pinned down in a crumbling compound in the Horn of Africa exactly 6 months ago. The man whose team had been saved by a lone, blacked-out helicopter that defied orders flew straight into a wall of RPG fire and held a hover just long enough to drag him and his men out of a slaughterhouse. He only knew the pilot's voice over the radio, a calm, female voice that had refused to leave them behind. Uncle Rick slowly turned his head to look at his son. "Tyler," Uncle Rick said, and the deadly, icy calm in his tone made my own blood run cold. "Yeah, Dad?" Tyler stammered, shrinking back slightly. "Apologize to her," Uncle Rick commanded softly. "Now." Tyler let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, looking around the patio as if waiting for someone to yell surprise. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting between his father and me. "Dad, come on! It's just Elena," Tyler scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "I was just busting her chops. You don't need to get all intense about it. Why should I apologize for making a joke about her call sign?" Uncle Rick didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When you have spent decades commanding men in the most hostile environments on Earth, true authority doesn't require volume. It requires gravity. And right now, Uncle Rick was a black hole. "Because, Tyler," Uncle Rick said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, "you are standing in the presence of someone who has seen more hell than you could ever comprehend in your miserable, padded life. And because 6 months ago, Outlaw 6'4" is the only reason I am alive to stand on this patio today." A collective gasp swept through the family. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with both hands. My dad took a step back, his eyes wide, looking from his brother to me as if he were seeing us both for the very first time. Tyler's smirk vanished entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the string lights. "Dad, what are you talking about? You said your last deployment before retiring was an advisory role. You said you were just training locals." "I lied," Uncle Rick stated plainly, not taking his eyes off me, "to protect the family, just like Elena has been doing." He took another step toward me, his heavy boots crunching the remaining shards of his glass. The smell of spilled bourbon mixed with the fading scent of hickory smoke. Uncle Rick stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving as he stared into my face. He was searching for the girl he knew, the quiet niece who read books in the corner during holidays, and instead, he was finding the eyes of a night stalker. "We were in the Horn of Africa," Uncle Rick began, his voice raspy, echoing in the dead silence of the backyard. He wasn't talking to Tyler anymore. He was talking to the family, to me, to the ghosts of that night. Joint Task Force. A high-value target extraction that went completely sideways. Intel was bad. We walked into a trap. 4 dozen heavily armed insurgents pinned us down in a crumbling concrete compound. We took casualties within the first 3 minutes. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, the memory flooding back with violent clarity. The visuals, the blinding flashes of RPGs tearing through the pitch-black sky. The sounds, the frantic, distorted screams over the encrypted radio net. The stakes. The knowledge that if we didn't get them out, 14 American operators were going to be slaughtered on foreign soil. "We were completely cut off," Uncle Rick continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Ammo was black. We had 2 men bleeding out. Command told us an extraction was impossible. The anti-aircraft fire was too heavy. They told us to dig in and wait for daylight. We knew we wouldn't make it to daylight." Tyler swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked physically ill. The fake warrior facade he had worn all day had entirely melted away, revealing a scared, insecure boy who was suddenly realizing the immense gap between wearing a weighted vest on a treadmill and bleeding out in a foreign desert. And then, Uncle Rick said, his eyes shining with unshed tears in the dim light, the radio cracked. A pilot broke protocol, ignored the holding pattern, ignored the abort order from command. A blacked-out MH-60M came screaming out of the dark, dropping into the compound courtyard like a bat out of hell. The courtyard was too small. The rotors were practically chewing the concrete off the walls. Tracers were bouncing off the fuselage. He took a shaky breath, finally stepping up to me. "I remember dragging my point man up the ramp," Uncle Rick whispered. "I remember looking toward the cockpit. I couldn't see the pilot. Just the glow of the instrument panels and the dark silhouette of an aviator helmet. But I heard her over the comms, calm as a Sunday morning, telling us to hold on. The call sign was Outlaw 64. Uncle Rick reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently grasping my shoulders. His grip was entirely different from Tyler's stiff, obligatory hug. It was the grip of a drowning man who had been pulled onto a lifeboat. "I tried to find out who flew that bird when I got back to Bragg," Uncle Rick said, his voice cracking. "Command stonewalled me. Classified. 160th SOAR protects their own. I never imagined." "You needed a ride, Senior Chief," I said softly, the nickname slipping out naturally. "We don't leave ghosts in the dark. Night stalkers don't quit." A single tear tracked down Uncle Rick's weathered face. He pulled me into a fierce, crushing embrace. It wasn't the hug of an uncle to a niece. It was the sacred, unspoken bond of those who had shared the unforgiving crucible of combat. I hugged him back, burying my face in his shoulder, finally letting go of the tension I had been carrying for 18 months. When Uncle Rick finally pulled back, he swiped a hand across his eyes, composing himself. The terrifying stillness had returned to his demeanor, but this time, it wasn't directed at the lake. It was directed entirely at his son. Tyler had shrunk back against the brick wall of the house. He looked absolutely miserable, his craft beer abandoned on a side table. The alpha male podcast bravado, the boasts about corporate retreats, the mocking insults they had all been reduced to ash in the presence of true, terrifying reality. "Tyler," Uncle Rick said, turning slowly to face him. "Dad, I didn't know," Tyler stammered, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "I swear, I was just making a joke. I thought she was just flying supply routes. I didn't mean anything by it." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Uncle Rick said, his tone utterly merciless. "You assumed. You let your ego and your insecurities dictate your mouth. You mocked a woman who has more courage, more grit, and more honor in her little finger than you have demonstrated in your entire life." Uncle Rick pointed a stiff, uncompromising finger at the ground in front of me. "Get over here," Uncle Rick commanded. Tyler didn't hesitate. He practically stumbled over his own feet, walking over to where I stood. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at my shoes, his shoulders slumped, looking like a scolded child, rather than a 28-year-old executive. "Look at her," his father barked. Tyler slowly raised his head. His eyes were red, humiliated, and thoroughly broken. "Elena," Tyler choked out, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I was an idiot. I was arrogant, and I had absolutely no right to speak to you that way. I'm sorry for disrespecting you, and thank you for bringing my dad home." I looked at Tyler for a long moment. I could have twisted the knife. I could have humiliated him further. But the truth was, I didn't care enough about his opinion to punish him for it. I had my validation. I had the only respect that mattered. "Apology accepted, Tyler," I said evenly. "Just remember, the loudest guy in the room is rarely the one doing the heavy lifting." Tyler nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "I will, I promise." He practically fled the patio after that, muttering an excuse to his mother before disappearing inside the house. The heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped the family began to dissipate, replaced by a stunned, awe-filled murmur. My dad walked over, his eyes brimming with tears. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight. "I am so proud of you, Elena," he whispered into my hair. "So incredibly proud." "Thanks, Dad," I smiled, patting his back. "Sorry I couldn't tell you." "I understand," he nodded, pulling back and wiping his eyes. "Though, I think my heart rate is going to be elevated for the next 3 days." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of hushed conversations and renewed respect. The younger cousins, who had giggled at Tyler's jokes earlier, now looked at me with wide, reverent eyes, asking timid questions about helicopters and flying in the dark. I gave them sanitized, exciting versions of the truth, leaving out the blood, the fear, and the tracer fire. Later that night, long after the rest of the family had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the edge of the dock, letting my feet dangle over the cool, dark water of the lake. The string lights had been turned off. The only illumination came from the brilliant wash of stars overhead. Footsteps padded onto the wooden planks. Uncle Rick sat down next to me. He held 2 fresh glasses of bourbon, handing one to me. I accepted it silently. "You're a long way from the desert, Captain," Uncle Rick said quietly, clinking his glass against mine. "So are you, Senior Chief," I replied, taking a slow sip. The liquor burned pleasantly down my throat. We sat there for a long time, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. We didn't talk about the mission again. We didn't need to. We talked about the silence of the night sky, the feeling of the wind, and the heavy, quiet burden of carrying secrets for the people we loved. Tyler never bothered me again. In fact, the next time I saw him at Thanksgiving, he was quiet, polite, and spent the entire evening helping my dad wash the dishes. He had finally learned the most important lesson a man can learn. True warriors don't need to announce their presence. Their actions echo long after the smoke clears. True strength isn't found in loud boasts, unearned arrogance, or putting others down to elevate yourself. The real heroes, the ones holding the line in the darkest corners of the world, are often the quietest people in the room. They don't seek applause, they simply do the impossible because it has to be done. If this story of respect, silent professionalism, and family justice resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life storytelling.